Good afternoon, everyone. I am Darianne Christian, the chair of Newfields Board of Trustees, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural session of the Newfields Speaker Series presented by Bank of America. I'm sorry that we could not enjoy, this event in person, but I am excited for us to be together, even virtually. What I'm most excited about is the opportunity to hear from some of the smartest and most experienced people in our field for a conversation about one of the most important questions our society faces, including America's cultural institutions and including Newfields. Specifically, how do we achieve a lasting culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in our organizations and beyond? The speaker series we are launching today is reflective of the commitments our organization and Newfields leadership made earlier this year in the Newfields Action Plan. Today, we invite Newfields members to invite Newfields members and the public, as well as our own board, staff, and colleagues to join in a dialogue with leaders in our field as they share their thoughts on creating a more empathetic, inclusive, and community-focused cultural institution, not just here at Newfields, but all institutions. And first and foremost, I would like to thank our longstanding partner, Bank of America, for sponsoring the Newfields Speaker Series. They continue to support us from our community engagement efforts to conservation work, and even serving as presenting sponsors of Winter Lights. Their commitment to DEIA, work in the community and with art organizations is a reason they graciously have agreed to sponsor the series today. Please welcome Andrew Krask from Bank of America for a few words about their support of the Newfields Speaker Series.
Thank you, Darianne, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Andy Krask, and I am the president of Bank of America, Indianapolis. Bank of America is now in its fourth year of partnership with Newfields, and we couldn't be prouder of how our partnership has evolved. As you have all hopefully come to see over these past few years, when Bank of America decides to invest in a not-for-profit, we don't just write a check and walk away, we show up. We show up by making Winter Lights more accessible to people from low to moderate income families, by providing valuable internship experience for our Bank of America student leaders, and by having our volunteers roll up their sleeves and clear honeysuckle from the 100 acres. Despite recent challenges, we never wavered in our continuing support and partnership with Newfields because we believe in Newfields. Bank of America has a long demonstrated history of diversity and inclusion initiatives that have allowed us to be widely recognized as a leader in this area. We understand this arena, and we recognize that we still have work to do, so we knew it was important to stand together with Newfields. This speaker series is an important step toward the growth and change recognized by Newfields as critical in being a diverse and inclusive institution. Newfields makes Indianapolis an infinitely more beautiful and interesting place to live, work, and visit. We are a better community because of the diverse experiences you offer and because of the work you are doing to be a better Newfields. I'm excited about what will come from the speaker series and the other work you are doing to make Newfields a more diverse and inclusive place for those who work, live, and visit here. It's now my pleasure to turn it back over to Darianne to introduce our first two speakers. Darianne?
Thank you, Andy. Now, our two speakers today will set the stage for what I hope and expect to be an ongoing and very rewarding conversation. I thank them for being with us. The format of the speaker series is meant to spark discussion. The speakers will present and there will be time for questions at the end. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our special guests. Cinnamon Catlin Legutko and Chris Taylor are the co-editors of The Inclusive Museum Leader, published this year by the American Alliance of Museums. Cinnamon Catlin Legutko has been working in museums for 25 years and has served in leadership roles for 20 of them. She has been director of the Illinois State Museum since 2019 and served as president and CEO of the Abe Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine. At the Abe Museum, she co-led their decolonization initiative and co-developed practices to ensure collaboration and cooperation with the Wabanaki people. Chris Taylor is the Chief Inclusion Officer for the state of Minnesota. In this role, he facilitates more welcoming and inclusive organizational cultures across Minnesota state agencies. Chris spent nearly 14 years at the Minnesota Historical Society, where he developed and implemented a vision for systemic change across the MNHS network and led organizational change efforts to respond to shifting demographics in Minnesota. In their book, Cinnamon and Chris say they believe that leaders of cultural institutions, not just the staff, should be the advocates for changing exclusive systems and practices at their museums. That's something I believe in very strongly, and I am eager to hear more. So let me thank each of you for being a part of today's discussion. We are planning more conversations like these in the next few months, and we will update you on the speaker series schedule as it is confirmed. But now I turn the conversation over to Cinnamon, Catlin, Legutko, and Chris Taylor.
Thank you, Darianne. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Taylor. Very excited to be here with you and to talk about inclusive leadership, talk about museums, and talk about things that we are passionate about. And so just excited to be here with you. And as Darianne said, I'm currently the Chief Inclusion Officer for the state of Minnesota. And one of the things that I think, I get very passionate about is how organizations can perpetuate the status quo, but how leaders can intervene in that process and really leverage their influence, their leadership, their knowledge and their skills to really shift those kind of patterns of exclusion to be more inclusive. And so really excited about that. And that's kind of where I'm approaching this work from today. Cinnamon.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's always great to be with Chris and to participate in these conversations. Of course, you've already heard the formal introduction. And just to add to that, I'll say that, the focus of my work in museum spaces is around change. What can we question? What can we reshape? What can we do better? And that's really led to this moment in this conversation, which we'll build together today. But I'll also say that I really feel that we're in this incredible moment of change. And if each of us as leaders of museums, as I am now and have been, can take that power that we have, that designated power, if you will, to be the leaders of organizations, if we can take this moment and reflect and transition and lead in new directions, my goodness, it would be a glorious moment. And that's what I'm here for. And I look forward to this conversation. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Wouldn't be 2021 meeting presentation or whatever without, correct? So what I was saying to myself was, one of the most powerful learning spaces that I've been in since my museum career was having really kind of informal dialogues with colleagues around the country, right? And as we were kind of looking at conferences and whatever, these conversations that we would have informally amongst small groups or individuals really was where I could understand better several things. First of all, what this work really is. And so when we talk about the work is really kind of personal work, but it's also institutional work, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But also there's just some kind of through lines that we see in museums and talking with colleagues across the country at various venues, that became kind of clear. And so, when Cinnamon invited me to be a part of the Inclusive Museum Leader Project, it really was a space to kind of bring some of those conversations to light, right? And to ask people who we've worked with, who we admire, who we've learned from, to really write chapters about their experience. And so it was really a neat opportunity for me. And then being able to talk to you all today, and Cinnamon and I were kind of thinking about how we wanted to set this up. We very much both were feeling like having a conversation was one of the best ways to really kind of think about this. And so absent a formal presentation, Cinnamon and I are going to dialogue a little bit, and we have some questions that that we will ask each other. And then we want to invite you all into the dialogue towards the end here, and be able to get questions from you all, and be able to answer those questions, or have you respond to things that we share with you all today. And so just kind of to ground us a little bit, you know, as we were thinking about what really needs to be kind of the things around inclusive leadership, the grounding points, the anchor points, so to speak, you know, we were really kind of the same mind that this idea of self-awareness, this kind of sense of commitment to systemic change, and this vulnerability, this hunger for personal growth were all things that really were important, kind of cornerstones to how we view inclusive leadership. And that's gonna kind of undergird our conversation today. But then, you know, we can take it wherever you all would like to after that. So, Senator, I'm gonna tee up kind of the first question here. You know, and thinking about kind of, in my experience, leaders often feel as though kind of they need to have all the answers. I feel like kind of a leadership quality that's elevated in our society, or at least they need to appear to. I found that this can often hinder the type of systemic change that we're looking for. So what can leaders do to kind of create a practice to be vulnerable as it relates to any blind spots that they have? You know, what have you done over your career to kind of explore your blind spots or learn to be vulnerable?
Sure. And I think it's always important before I even start sharing my experiences to acknowledge that I have a long way to go. And that's really critical to always remind myself, is that, you know, this is a journey of personal development and growth. And for anyone looking to transform their mindset, their approach, their style, it's always going to be an evolution. So I always want to say that, not necessarily as a disclaimer, but as a frame for the kinds of things that I want to share about leadership today. And then also to say that, you know, as another part of this is that I'm compelled to talk more and more publicly about my leadership journey because I don't see other leaders doing it. I don't see them showing up in training spaces, either with their colleagues or their staffs, creating those spaces. I don't hear of it, I don't see of it. And I think that is in part addressing your question of, you know, leaders feel like they need to have answers, and you aren't perceived to have the answers if you're in training sometimes. And so that vulnerability is elusive for many. And that vulnerability is also built as a tower around people in leadership, right? When we talk about the ivory tower, that's a thing in large organizations, either built by the leader or those around leadership. And I'm learning a great deal about that now, having moved into a larger museum, the Illinois State Museum, compared to where I worked before, the Abbey Museum, which was much smaller. That ivory tower may be built by you or built by somebody else. And to be aware of that space you're in as a leader is step number one. To know that these structures have been built and these assumptions have been built helps me figure out where to go next, right? How do I break that down? How do I overcome? How do I open myself up when I acknowledge and speak to the fact that I'm in this position and I'm being asked to answer a lot of questions and make a lot of decisions, but I am one person, a person with experience, a person with training, yes, but there's absolutely no way I can have all the best answers. And I need to create pathways so that I can be better informed, so that I can listen, so that I can be responsive, nimble, and flexible in my decision making, because change is constant and the conditions tell us that we need to change often. And so as I recognize these structures, these power structures in museum spaces and larger institutions for that matter, I also need to feel powerlessness, right? So doing what I can to recognize when I don't have power and examining how I feel with that, how I look with that. And what I think the through line, always in our conversations, Chris, but also in how we write and how we edit, the through line is that whole person structure of thinking and learning, a heart-centered kind of leadership style where the individual really matters, right? So if I'm not showing myself as an individual to another, how are they going to show up for me, right? How are we going to exchange? And so recognizing that helps me become vulnerable, but also helps me understand I am powerless in truth when it comes to the change we want to make. And then on top of that, that awareness, to speak to these themes we're talking about, it's about training as well, submitting to the intensive, deliberate, ongoing training from racial bias training I've participated in to cultural competency training. Some of that you've led me through, as well as other courses I've been in. Anti-racism training, the methodologies around that have been an intensive line of coursework I've done. And once it begins, once you start to dig into this personal work and personal growth, if you mean it and if you're going to walk the walk, it doesn't end. It's a journey that you stay on, and it's a new way of working. And it hasn't, believe it or not, added to my work plate. It's made my work plate much more glorious, much more effective, and more meaningful for this museum space that I'm interested in building. And I know a lot of my colleagues are interested in building that is inclusive and focused on reducing harm. There's, of course, other ways people do this work to prepare themselves to recognize blind spots, but that's just a slice of what I've done. And I find, in fact, one of my recent reflections, that it's a little bit easier to be vulnerable in a smaller organization than a larger organization. That's one of my new learnings, if you will, because in a larger organization, speaking to that ivory tower mentality, there are massive structures built before you ever walked into that job. And whether you want to demolish them or not is one thing. But everybody around you recognizes that those have been built. And for them to be empowered to cross over those structures, those barriers, and to question is an equal effort I need to support and engage in, which is my new space that I'm in. And then you add to it that I work for state government, and there's a whole other layer of structure that just because I want it this way, I want to be inclusive, vulnerable, and open, doesn't mean I'm operating in a system that allows for it. So I have to start pulling different levers and having different conversations. So hopefully that gives you a little snapshot of the kind of work I've been doing. And I know we'll touch on it some more. And I certainly want to turn it back to you, Chris. When you're working with top leadership, how do you promote this idea, this importance of self-awareness? What other pathways have you seen leaders take to really move toward an inclusive model of work?
That's a great question. Thank you, Cinnamon. It's hard because I feel like in our society, leaders get leadership positions because of their experience and because of what they've done in the past, right? And so it's this reward system for having the answers. And it's interesting because when you start to either as a consultant or, when I was working in the museum field, or even when I'm working with our state commissioners, it's really about understanding your sphere of influence, right? And so things that you do are as a leader or as at the top of the organization are magnified 100 times or 1,000 times, just because of your visibility, but also because of the weight of the decisions that you're making, right? And so just to use my career as an example at the Historical Society, when I was doing teacher education programs and I was making decisions about those types of things, that carries some level of weight and some level of impact on my colleagues or the people that we serve. But when I was the chief inclusion officer, I was making decisions that were impacting everybody in the organization, and our members, our donors, and so understanding kind of that, and just I think it's an inherent understanding, but really bringing that to the forefront, because I think that's where you can really start to conversation for change, right? Because I've seen a number of friends, colleagues who are doing good work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, who just don't have the sphere of influence to have the impact to create that kind of systemic change that we mentioned earlier, right? And so creating that awareness of, hey, you know, I have the ability to really bring my organization into this space where I want it to be, where we can really live our values, we can meet our mission, these types of things, but also be inclusive spaces. Now, I'm not naive to the point where I understand that it's not always that easy. And we'll talk about boards in a little bit, but I think there are so much that that leaders can do from that influence standpoint. I think another thing that I would say is like, what kind of assessments are you doing? There's one in particular that I like to use. It's the Intercultural Development Inventory. IDI is kind of the acronym for it. And what it does is it puts you on a continuum, kind of assessing your ability to work across difference, right? And so do you expect people to kind of work the way you do, or can you be that bridge to kind of engage with people who are culturally different than you in a way that is inclusive and in a way that brings them in or draws them in rather than pushes them out? And it's these types of things when we talk about blind spots, and, you know, we talk about or we see like Myers-Briggs, and we see these types of things, and those are important, don't get me wrong. But where we need to start to delve into is these things around intercultural competence, or our skills around diversity or equity work, or our knowledge, and how are we assessing our skills there, right? I had to develop a lot of my skills and seek out experiences to kind of build my repertoire around equity work as a consultant or as whatever. And so it's not often taught in our programs or kind of this very concrete way. So how are you assessing your ability? And that will help you understand where you need to start on your journey. And I appreciate that that's where you started your comments, Cinnamon, is we're all on a journey. I continue to be on my journey. You continue to be on yours. It's really critical to understand where we're at in that process, though, right? And maybe it's not where you want to be, but that's okay. That maybe gives you that intrinsic motivation to get there, or to do that work or whatever. And so I think those are some things that, as I talk about awareness with leaders, is just really talking about like, hey, you know, like your influence is a different level than other people in this organization. And your awareness of your blind spots, your awareness of your tendencies, your awareness of either your ability to push and model equity and inclusion, or your kind of ability to talk the talk but not walk the walk, that's going to set the tone for the institution, right? And so really thinking about those things from a leadership standpoint, I think is critical. And then it's, you know, digging in to do the work, right? And so those are some things that I talk about. And, you know, one thing that I appreciate about you, Cinnamon, and some other folks that, you know, I've worked with in the past is just, hey, here I am, and this is where I'm at on my journey, and that's fine. And it's such a nuanced thing in our culture to be, I don't want to say ashamed, that's not the right word, but like, if you're not where you want to be, or you're not in that place where society says you should be, we don't want to put that out there. But, you know, that's a cultural thing that we need to shift. And that's one of the things I like about the IDI, is gives us a language to talk about where we're at and things of that nature. So Yeah, you know, and I think that leadership piece and the connection to systemic change is kind of where I want to go next, if you're okay with that. And I think, you know, when we talk about systemic change, we talk about systemic change as being deep, right? And so we're really reaching into the core of our institutions to do things differently. That's what change is, right? It's long term, so it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to be, you know, a quick fix. And change is just often hard. We're comfortable and happy doing things the way that we do them, right? And so sometimes we see surface level changes that kind of give the impression that we're doing this work or that we're making change, but we really don't address underlying values or underlying behaviors that kind of support the status quo. How would you describe the type of systemic change that needs to happen for museums to truly become inclusive spaces?
It's a big question because it is a big change that's required. And to even approach the systemic change that's required, there has to be the time built for research and understanding the history of museums and their institutional origins. And we certainly don't have time for this today. And it's something I've spoken extensively about and written about how museums have been built as exclusive spaces. And as you do this work, it's surprising to find out a lot of your colleagues maybe haven't read up on museum history, and certainly your boards haven't read up on museum history, but it's there for you. And then once you do that understanding, then match it up to your institution's history. Is there a legacy of racism that's been deliberately exacerbated in your communities? You know, what is that footprint you've left in your community? Understanding that history and acknowledging it is one of the only ways you're going to begin to create authentic systemic change, in my experience and opinion. And once you have that laid out, we all understand it, we understand the truth, you can start to make big change. And some of those are simple, some of them are large, and much of it's abstract, right? There's a little bit of an assumption that folks are going to be doing a personal beyond their journeys and doing some work, but oftentimes they aren't. So you have to start addressing policy and creating statements that indicate a change is coming. Here's where we're going, laying it out very transparently and visibly. That's the process I'm in right now at the Illinois State Museum, architecting a theory of change. What is it we're going to do? What are the things we must prioritize so we emerge as an inclusive institution? Make that transparent. And I think that's something leaders hang up on a lot. They don't want to be bothered with sharing some information that has been traditionally given to only them. How about flipping that on its head and making it incredibly transparent and creating vehicles for staff to respond to these ideas and notions or engage in conversations and dialogues as you're architecting change? Build those spaces for intentional listening and be really good at listening is one way of creating the change. And then start to find ways to share decision-making processes. What can you do through cohort structures and management and leadership? How can you start diagnosing where decision-making is happening? Maybe it's not just resting with you. Where are these other nodes or powers of decision-making? How do you share that and make that visible so everybody understands? Another way, and I've already mentioned this, is that heart-centered thinking and action. Really think about who you are as an individual and the gifts you bring, each and every one of you in an institution, and how you can maybe do your work differently with those full person, whole person talents. Maybe you work in a museum collection space and you're working in the history collection, but you're typically very internally focused, but you have these amazing community connections. How can you bring that into the conversation and point leadership in better and in more inclusive directions through your personal experience? It can be done. Absolutely, but leadership has to be willing to receive that, right? So creating ways for that kind of dialogue to begin and start to shift power and authority, including the boardroom. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but specifically leadership needs to shift power. not only in creating more decision-making vehicles, listening, and other ways you could identify shifting power, but also acknowledging that before you enter the room as a leader, your power has already entered it. Everybody knows you're coming with something by the nature of who you are and the role that you're in. And if you don't speak to that, people will maybe be quiet, or they find themselves in compromised spaces, or they don't feel like they can challenge or be part of the decision-making. Being aware of that is critical in the systemic change that's asked of all of us. And the last thing I just want to say, because there isn't a cookie cutter approach to this at all. It's going to be every institution's story, their history, the people who work there, the agenda in front of them that will determine that systemic change. But I think there are skills within there, and that's what I'm trying to describe to help you do that. But I will say there's one thing I've learned, and it's something I'm truly grappling with right now. I learned this from our mutual friend and colleague, Nikhil Trivedi, who works at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm very fortunate that he now serves on the board of the Illinois State Museum. We were talking recently about systemic change in institutions and what does it take? And that so often there is something that's born at a mid-range or lower level staffing structure that starts to ignite. And maybe it's an equity team, maybe it's just a book group where they're getting together and talking about inclusion and how they can make change, but something's sparking, and they continue to meet and they continue to build momentum and want to see change. And so often that's what's happening, and leadership isn't doing the same. And it's when, this is what Nikhil reminded me of, it's when both are sparking and changing that extraordinary things can happen, and change can dig deep and be embedded and continue. When leadership, that C-suite level of an institution, and multiple staffing levels are all working in the directions of that inclusion points them in, that you can really affect change. And what I'm finding is that sometimes leadership is completely blind to it. And these staffs and these teams are really struggling because they can't get that upward push that they need. And I'm also finding institutions where leadership is really all for it, but they're not getting the buy-in from staff. And how do you get that to happen? I feel like that's the harder nut to crack than a change in leadership, quite frankly, because a board can affect that change in leadership. But if a staff isn't wanting it, what's that leader to do? That's an interesting pinch point that I'm very curious about. But I do think all of those elements create systemic change. And I want to speak to the power of the board. Having worked for boards my entire career, I know that it can be obliterated overnight. All that good work can be obliterated overnight. If a board says, nope, we're not going to do this. This isn't what we want to do. You're not the person for the job. By the way, the staff needs to change because we're shifting funding structures. You name it. The power that boards have is intense, to say the least. And if boards were to signal more that they want inclusive leadership, how might that impact the behavior of current leaders or aspiring leaders or emerging leaders? How might that change this dynamic if boards really signaled and did the work to reframe, rethink what it means to be inclusive?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that, in the interview that I did with Marie Viner for the book was enlightening for me, because she works with a lot of boards and searches for a lot of leaders, right? And this is what we're talking about. From my experience, a lot of work is done to please the board. A lot of effort goes into making sure that the board is in the know, but that the board is also, we're meeting the expectations of the board. And that's important. I mean, the boards set the direction for institutions, right? And so if boards were to start to really outline a vision around inclusion and equity and what that means for museums, and that truly is one of the hallmarks of what they consider success, I think it would have a huge impact. Because I think that then becomes where a lot of the energy goes to meet those goals or meet those expectations. I think a number of things go into that, though. I think clarity of expectations, right? And so defining what success looks like. Does success look like having a more diverse workforce? I mean, that's one way to define it, but what is the experience of those employees who are not in or of the dominant culture, right? They could be working there, but their experience could be incredibly difficult, and they could be carrying a large emotional burden from that. That is not how I would define success, right? So I think boards doing their work and thinking about, okay, well, what are the benefits of inclusion and equity? And this is where we get into the business case for some of this work. And it took me a long time to feel comfortable talking about the business case, because really the moral imperative of this work is what drives the passion for me. But you speak to different levels the way they need to be spoken to, and boards are fiscally responsible. Boards are responsible for success in a number of different ways. And so when you can make that argument to the board that, hey, this is good for us as an organization, for the overall health of the organization in a lot of different ways. It makes for better decision-making, better collaboration. There's research out there that shows that when you're able to bring that diversity into your workforce and really leverage that through an inclusive organizational culture, the external impact, whether it's kind of market share, membership, your customer base, all of this gets larger and more diverse as well, right? And so who doesn't want that as a board member for their institution? I think outlining that case for them is something that needs to be done. But again, that's going to require whoever's doing that outlining of the case for them to really understand what they're talking about. It's going to require that you've done your homework and that you understand what we're talking about. And then I always like to weave in the moral case with the business case, but that's just me, right? But I also think too, like boards need to be doing their work. They need to also understand and be passionate about this. I've seen situations where diversity, inclusion, equity is talked about as a priority because that's what people in the room feel like should be a priority. It's not really a commitment. It's not really understood at a level where, there's passion behind it, there's motivation behind it, there's resources behind it. And so boards need to be doing their own work to really understand what benefits are brought to the table. I used to like to say, if you're a leader or somebody in a leadership role, whether it's a board or whatever, who's not truly thinking about the relevance of your museum long-term as it relates to how the demographic is shifting in this country and where all these things are going, you're not doing your job as a steward of that museum, right? And I think that is just something that's paramount. And whether it's the business case or the moral case, it is incredibly important. And so boards need to be doing their learning, and whether that's as a cohort, they're finding their own, as we heard from, our sponsor at Bank of America, they have diversity programs. And so as we're bringing people from corporate to be on our boards, ensuring that they're doing that. But, if that becomes a criteria of how you get on a board, things change, right? Or you look for different types of people. So, but, to circle back to your original question and just to kind of really hammer home, when boards change, so will institutions. That is the level of influence that boards have. And if they start to look for leaders who exhibit inclusive behaviors or have a track record of successful inclusion, equity, diversity initiatives, these types of things, and that becomes priority, that's where success then is defined. That moves the goalposts to where the success is now defined based on some of that. So there would be a powerful way to shorten the time frame around this type of systemic change that we're talking about. But I think that also requires personal growth. And I wanna ask a question here. Cinnamon, I've known you for a long time. And for that entire time, one of the reasons why I gravitated towards you is you viewed yourself as being on a journey as a continual learner in this space. And you mentioned it off the top with your remarks earlier. What have been some of the most challenging points along your journey? And what have you learned that has made you a more inclusive leader based on those points along the way?
Yeah, I think a critical part of this work is to really recognize those challenges and to know that they mean something and to know that you can overcome them. And one of the things I think a lot about is that I am incredibly solution-minded. It's what's gotten me jobs. But it turns out being solution-minded is problematic and really hard-edged, right? I want to fix it. I want to go. Let's move. I can see the other side. And in the process of being so driven for the solution, you tumble over all kinds of hearts and minds and lived experience, right? When you're trying to focus on those results. So really understanding that about myself, that it shouldn't be my sales pitch, that I'm solution oriented. It should really be that I'm someone that can bring people along to make the best future possible for the institution. And so that's been a critical learning. And those learnings came to me not only through traditional leadership development efforts. I've continued to really engage in leadership development work, but they've also come to me through authentic conversations with folks, really opening up for feedback, which is also one of my huge personal challenges. I am horrible at asking for feedback, receiving feedback. It's a huge flaw of mine. There's a whole list of reasons why, and I'm working on it. But one of the things I can do is to overcome that challenge often and frequently and ask from others what I could have done better. Was that okay? How did that feel? What might I do differently next time? And creating space for that. That's a challenge I am actively working to overcome. And I mentioned already, encouraging the individual to show up at work, but I learned through these leadership trainings that I'm actually not very good at that. Some of the training I've gone through calls it encouraging the heart, really celebrating people at work. And here too, I think there's a long list of reasons why I'm not very good at it, but I think generationally I'm not good at it. Generation X really wants you to show up and do the work and get on with it. And you seem to forget that people need to be encouraged and nurtured, and that you feel better when you do that. And of course, folks perform in ways you can't even imagine when their heart has been encouraged. And that is a lesson that was way overdue for me to learn. Of course, you've already mentioned it, committing to the learning, the continued learning process. Being a constant learner is a mindset. And it has to be nurtured and considered regularly. What are your gaps? And also realizing that you've evolved, therefore you need different learning. So that was a big challenge for me, was that I thought I should just keep going back to the same kind of classes because I couldn't possibly know it all. But with the opportunity of working with a coach in diversity inclusion, understanding that my journey is a little bit different now, and that probably what I need at certain points along the way has changed. For example, I'm in a place now where I work with a peer group around leadership issues. I learn from peers really well. And I also need an accountability partner who really asks me what I'm doing. Did I do the best thing? Am I thinking of this? Someone to hold that mirror up for me. And I've also secured those folks from my learning because I'm in a different place in my journey. And of course, through that process, new challenges are created that you have to overcome because you can see them now. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so really being committed to that process, to that personal growth, has helped me take care when I need to, because it's painful, that growth. And I don't need to subjugate my work-life balance either, because I can't learn better if I've been focused on beating myself up or punishing myself for not having thought that through or didn't receive the feedback well. Really being mindful how I'm feeling on any given day before I have a difficult conversation makes that conversation become less difficult with a colleague. Learning that I only get to those really healthy spaces if I have a work-life balance. And there are, conversations aplenty around leaders and their inability to have a work-life balance. I'm done with compromising that. I have, had a long career now where I have compromised that, and I'm now in a position where I'm holding the line, and I'm holding the line for others about how they can really nurture their souls when they're not at work, and it doesn't have to compromise their lives or mine. And guess what? We're all better people at work, including me. Including the way that I learn is more resonant and more deep when I do that. So self-care is part of that, right? And we talk a lot about that in this work. And I think it's important to recognize that I'm just one kind of leader. It's my style. It's the way I engage. There are many other effective ways for leaders to demonstrate their style and their types. And I know you've seen quite a few in your journey, and I'd love to hear how they have demonstrated their growing edges. And if they've had a rough moment that you've been able to witness and cause someone, how would you like to see them address that? Like, what would you wish for someone who's really struggling with their journey to take that moment and recognize that they caused harm and nurture that growing edge? What have you seen, and what would you love to see? And then I know we'll be at a place for question and answer after that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the number one thing that I look for is it truly authentic, right? And so there's different ways you can own your mistakes. You can do it publicly, you can do it individually with the person. And so I've seen all of that, but I think for me, what I'm really trying to look for is, how authentic is this, right? Part of that is knowing what you did wrong. Part of that is avoiding apologies like, I'm sorry, but, right? It just needs to end that I'm sorry, right? And it's not about, I'm sorry, but this is what I really meant, or any of that, because that doesn't matter. Owning that mistake is really critical. And I think having been in situations where people are making that kind of recognition or apology in situations where I'm that other party, you can see it when it's authentic. And the way I react to that is, okay, well, let's use this as a growth opportunity. Let's use this as a learning opportunity. And I've been in other situations where it's like, I either get more frustrated, or I'm not even going to give the time or the space, right? Because if it's not authentic, I'm going to just, there's not even any reason to do it in the first place. It's a worse situation now because you approached me with, in a way that's just disingenuous, right? I think the dialogue piece, the curiosity, the willingness to learn about what did I do, how did it impact you, and what can I do better, right? And it's not always the responsibility of the person that you've offended or the parties that you've offended to answer those questions for you, but that's part of that awareness and that self-reflective process we were talking about before. Now you have some questions that you can go and answer, right? And you can go and find the answers to those. You can talk to people that you have good relationships with, that you can explain the situation and maybe understand what it is that you did that was off-putting or whatever. And so, I think it's that authenticity. I think it's the willingness to dialogue and learn, and then I think it's the subsequent actions after. So it's not just an in the moment thing, but it's also about how we see you do different down the road. And I think those are things that I definitely I'm looking for when those situations arise. And I appreciate when I see leaders do that. That is demonstrating to me that willingness to grow and to learn and to be better in the future. And that's fantastic. So we have some questions here. I know we have about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little less. So I want to, maybe we can run through these and you know, if we maybe don't both need to answer unless we're really burning on, I got something to say, but the first question, one of our greatest challenges in moving forward in our DEAI process at Newfields is the dedicated time to engage in training, reflection, and conversation. We are under tremendous pressure to add or replace content, but we aren't pruning. How have you seen other institutions be successful at building a foundation to not just encourage, but solidify their commitment to this initiative specifically within their leadership? Do you have thoughts on that, Cinnamon, or would you like me to take a swing at that?
Well, you go for it and I'll chime in.
Okay. So, you know, I think part of it is getting out of this maybe traditional sense of what training is, right? As Cinnamon mentioned before, you can do some more informal things like, you know, book clubs or these types of things. You can make space for just having dialogue with people who are different than you, even working in different departments or whatever. I do think the pruning piece is important because at times we got to step back and I think we got to say, like, you know, how do we make space for skills around inclusion if we're saying this is important? And I think it's really looking at, well, what are we already doing and why are we doing this? Questioning the assumptions behind, you know, do we need to have more museum specific technical type training, right? Or can we maybe pull some of that back a little bit or do that in different ways? And we can make space for some of these things that we're saying are important. I guarantee you people are on the lookout for that. If you're saying it's important and you're not taking the time or making sacrifices to switch out some of the other things to make space, it's going to be evident. And so I think sometimes you just have to make the hard decision and say, well, you know what, maybe we're going to have to pull that, you know, exhibition professional development because we need to do this intercultural competence stuff or whatever. So sometimes it's just a hard decision. I don't know if you have something to add.
Yeah, I would add that when I was at the Abbey Museum in Park Harbor, we had a transformational moment around this in that we were strategic planning. We had evolved into a place where we knew that we need to adopt decolonizing museum practices. This is about 2008, 2009. We had no idea what that meant, but we knew that to really transform the way we work with Indigenous communities was hinging upon that learning and that change. And so we went through a really thoughtful, I even describe it as a 2-year plan to plan strategic planning. We went through that much learning as an institution. And we chose our moments for that learning. We embedded it in board meetings, we embedded it in staff meetings. Some of it was special, other kinds of trainings, but most of it was really organic. But then we got to this strategic planning moment where we realized, all of us, that this work we were looking to do is not something we're doing. It's the only way we're doing, right? It becomes the lens. And then it becomes the only way you do the work. And it's not extra. And you also make decisions differently, right? So you're not going to do this kind of programming anymore because it doesn't line up with the lens that you've adopted and using. And we declared all of that publicly. We presented about it. We, for years we presented about it. We made our strategic plan very public on the website. We made it super transparent that this is the work we're doing and this is the lens we're using and we're learning and we want you to join us, right? So it is an institutional mindset. And it's not extra work when you do that shift and you make the commitment. And that's where I'm at now with the Illinois State Museum, helping people understand that we're not actually adding to your plate. We're prioritizing what's going on your plate so that it looks different as you move forward. Hopefully that helps. We have another question? let's see, you want me to take this next one? How should leaders and staff even approach becoming more inclusive, vulnerable, and open without the giant of cancel culture in the background preventing true change? Well, that's a real question, and I'll just start by saying that if we operate in a space of fear, we're not going to get anything done, right? So fear isn't a nourishing element of our work. Fear-based learning doesn't create change or fill you up in any way. I understand that this is a real situation in our culture and that we are worried about being called out publicly. But in those moments, there's so many things we can do to create a posture of learning, to really acknowledge and have a forum. A forum like this, the speaker series, is a great example. You can produce programming that really comes right at it. This was said about us as an institution. Let's talk about it. You can do that internally, visibly, externally. But at the end of the day, if we're living in fear, nothing's going to change. And that's how I approach it. I know that can sound very Pollyanna. So I'd be curious to know what Chris thinks about that.
Well, I think in a way it's about who's canceling you, right? I mean, for a long time, there's been particular communities that have canceled you because you've not really specifically represented their history or their culture or, whatever. And so I think the right thing is always the right thing. And I think you get to decide what the right thing is. But if it is about creating this change, and so that, for instance, and I don't know exactly the specifics of like how your strategic plan is laid out or whatever, if it is about reaching out to communities that traditionally have not been engaged by Newfields in the past, and there's segments of your traditional audience that's going to cancel you because of that, if it's still the right thing, then it's the right thing, right? And in the end, you hope for a net gain because you are going to retain a lot of your traditional audience, and you're going to add new audiences. And so I think, cancel culture, and I hope I'm understanding the question in the right way. I think museums have been canceled for decades from certain communities already, and I think that it comes down to museums should be for everyone, and everyone should be able to be engaged by and see themselves represented in those museums. And I think you could make the argument that museums have canceled certain cultures just by the traditional way that they work. So, I think how we define cancel culture and whatever, but I think, Cinnamon's first statement, doing this work from a space of fear, I think it just resonates. If that is what you all feel like is your North Star, is to engage those communities, then you do that, and the reactions will be what the reactions will be, right? So that's how I would, yes, that's how I would answer that. So, so the next question, can you share any advice or insight on appropriate ways to make space without tokenizing BIPOC colleagues? On page 114 of the book, page 8 of the PDF that was shared on the website, there's a paragraph about giving up your spot, that not being really all that effective. I hear the logic laid out in this paragraph, and I'm curious about alternative solutions. If you find yourself in an all-white or otherwise seemingly homogenous leadership or task force space, what is the most productive way to bring in diverse voices to the conversation without tokenizing or relying on BIPOC staff to do additional emotional labor? Do you have thoughts on that, Cinnamon?
Ooh, lots of thoughts. The first thing that comes to mind is something that I learned even through our process of creating this book, and I'm forgetting who said it in the interviews, but someone talked about the fact that you really have to engage a consultant throughout this whole work. You may engage a consultant to get you started and may think, okay, now we have these systems in place and here we go. We're off and running, and you disengage with the consultant. But the nature of the change, the systemic change that's required of us, means we need a third party set of eyes helping us, pushing us, looking out for where we need to go at all times, which was a really interesting learning for me. It's like this toggle switch to just keep investing in so that you are making spaces that aren't tokenizing BIPOC staff. That's not, of course, the only answer. Another answer is to concurrently deeply work on changing your recruitment strategies so that rooms are filled with people of color and tokenization actually can't take root. But also on top of that, if it gets to the point where it's required, and I've seen this happen, pulling white people into their own learning spaces to learn together, and asking for BIPOC folks to not have to do that emotional labor, really training the white folks. It's a risk institutionally to separate like that. But if a consultant isn't getting you there, if personal learning isn't getting you there, if the way you've hired people isn't getting you there, then you are going to have to cross into those desperate measures. That's what comes to mind. Go ahead and add to that, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what you just said, but I'll use myself as an example. So if we have an all-white room and you say, hey, Chris, I want to give up my spot so that you can be in that room. That's all well and good. And that may make the person who gave up their spot feel better. It puts me in a real precarious spot because I'm coming into a room that's likely entrenched with white norms and how they work. There's going to be bias around the table, and it's me pushing the boulder uphill to get anything done. And I'm going to get frustrated. I'm going to feel even more marginalized. And it's just, I think it's while it's representational, it's not really getting us where we need to be. What I need for there to be my white colleagues in that room advocating for the same thing that I would advocate for. And you learn that by having relationships with folks who are different than you, who are able to have dialogue with you, share thoughts, educate, learn from, all of those things, right? Those types of relationships, because you are going to be received in a whole different way than I will be received. And for me to continue to talk about, hey, we need to be better at equity, hey, we need to be better at inclusion, it puts me in the spot where I'm that guy, right? And that's where I think we run into issues. And so what I would say is, you don't have to give up your spot, but you need to be an advocate for the work, right? And I think that making sure that you have a comfort level that you're advocating for the right things and whatever comes through those relationships. And so that's how I would answer that question. It's a great question. And I think, we do want those rooms to be more diverse, but we don't want to just give up spots. We want to make sure that those rooms are more diverse because we've shifted our systems or fixed our systems to be more equitable, and people are there because they deserve to be there, right? That last statement didn't sit well with me. It's not about not deserving to be there, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. So yeah, I think we can do one more, if that's okay. I think, let's see, there was this one. One of the challenges that Newfields seems to be monetizing what has been freely offered in ways that are perceived as unwelcoming and exclusionary. Any thoughts on approaches to fiscal sustainability and inclusion? Do you have any thoughts on that, Cinnamon, having been a director for several years, and then I can build off and chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of fear wrapped around that. There's a scarcity complex in the museum field that's pervasive in the biggest of institutions as well as the smallest of institutions. And that when you leave money on the table or don't take those opportunities to ask for money, you're really adding to the scarcity. And I think it begins with questioning the services you're offering. Do we need to be doing this? What's missing? And really reallocating resources. And going back to that example of the Abbey Museum, with that lens we began applying, we also began reallocating resources. We invested differently, and we made the way we invested transparent to folks in tribal communities, so they understood that this is how the money comes in and this is how we are investing it. And those decisions are being guided by Indigenous folks who are on our advisory council as well as on the board and on staff. So it's this very transparent, collaborative process that we use to transition how money came in and how best we should think through charging for products and services. Now, I will say that was accompanied by a really big shift in fundraising, how we fundraise, getting folks to individual donors to give to this work of change was a big lift. And there was about 1.5 years, 2 years where I was holding my breath so much I was about to pass out because I didn't know if it was going to work, and it didn't work for a little bit. And then it took root. And you hear this over and over again with foundations prioritizing this kind of work and wanting to fund it and making sure it's in place. But there are donors as well who are wanting to do that, and they can carry you across this gap while everyone else catches up. Certainly, enabling your board to get involved in this work sooner and later is critical because they can also be acolytes to the change and influence donor giving. But there is a shift that has to happen, which will make you less dependent on that earned income strategy that does create barriers to communities. It's a huge diverse stream of money that has to come in, and it is especially the case with Newfields. We all know that, but really prioritizing resource allocation to align with diversity inclusion work will make a difference. It just will. But you have to take a leap of faith and say, this is the way we're going, and we're on our way.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I would just say that, I think, when we look at various segments of communities, they're likely not going to base their decision to come on whether it's free or not, or if it used to be free and now there's, my guess is there are segments that were coming, or weren't coming even when it was free, right? And there's research out there that shows that, communities of color in particular are willing to spend their money on things that they truly believe in or feel like invested in, right? And so I think that's the thing is, how do you kind of shift what you offer to engage those communities in a way that they do see the value in spending their money to come and see what you offer, right? And they will. They absolutely will. At the Historical Society, we went from free to a paid deal, and we did research, and it wasn't that wasn't the barrier for why people weren't coming in, right? They would pay the money if they saw themselves represented, and in fact did when we have had specific exhibits that were targeted at various communities. People would come from those communities and they would pay the admission fee. So, I think it's a microcosm of a larger issue, and I think that when we talk about that deeper systemic change and people start to perceive your organization as one that has value for them, they will happily spend their money to come see what you do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris, too, because that was definitely the case at the Abbey as well. The barriers seem to dissolve when you're actually acknowledging the people who really matter and who are being underserved.
I think maybe we're a little over time, maybe out of time. So we certainly appreciate the invitation to come and have these conversations. I think, are we turning it back to Darien for some final comments?
Thank you, Cinnamon, and thank you, Chris. This is Lindsay Hammond, the Director of Public Programs at Newfields. On behalf of Newfields, I want to thank Cinnamon and Chris for sharing their expertise and insight with us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, for their support on the Newfields Speaker Series. And we would like to thank you, our members, public, staff, board, docents, and volunteers for joining us as we work to become a more empathetic, inclusive, and community-focused institution. Today's presentation will be added to our Newfields Speaker Series webpage, where you can also find updates on future conversations. You will receive a survey by email asking for your reflections on today's conversation. Your input is invaluable to us, and we hope to hear from you. We thank you for joining us. This concludes today's presentation.